Chapter 13. Usanga's Reward. For 2 days Tarzan of the Apes had been hunting leisurely to the north, and swinging in a wide circle, he had returned to within a short distance of the clearing where he had left Bertha Kircher and the young lieutenant. He had spent the night in a large tree that overhung the river only a short distance from the clearing, and now in the early morning hours he was crouching at the water's edge waiting for an opportunity to capture Pisa, the fish. Thinking that he would take it back with him to the hut where the girl could cook it for herself and her companion. Motionless as a bronze statue was the wily ape-man, for well he knew how wary is Pisa, the fish. The slightest movement would frighten him away, and only by infinite patience might he be captured at all. Tarzan depended upon his own quickness and the suddenness of his attack, for he had no bait or hook. His knowledge of the ways of the denizens of the water told him where to wait for Pisa. It might be a minute, or it might be an hour before the fish would swim into the little pool above which he crouched, but sooner or later one would come. That the ape-man knew, so with the patience of the beast of prey he waited for his quarry. At last there was a glint of shiny scales. Pisa was coming. In a moment he would be within reach, and then with the swiftness of light 2 strong brown hands would plunge into the pool and seize him, but just at the moment that the fish was about to come within reach, there was a great crashing in the underbrush behind the ape-man. Instantly Pisa was gone, and Tarzan, growling, had wheeled about to face whatever creature might be menacing him. The moment that he turned he saw that the author of the disturbance was Zutag. "What does Zutag want?" asked the ape-man. "Zutag comes to the water to drink," replied the ape. "Where is the tribe?" asked Tarzan. "They are hunting for pisangs and simatines farther back in the forest," replied Zutag. "And the Tarmangani she and bull?" asked Tarzan. "Are they safe?" "They have gone away," replied Zutag. "Kudu has come out of his lair twice since they left." "Did the tribe chase them away?" asked Tarzan. "No," replied the ape. "We did not see them go. We do not know why they left." Tarzan swung quickly through the trees toward the clearing. The hut and boma were as he had left them, but there was no sign of either the man or the woman. Crossing the clearing, he entered the boma and then the hut. Both were empty, and his trained nostrils told him that they had been gone for at least 2 days. As he was about to leave the hut, he saw a paper pinned upon the wall with a sliver of wood, and taking it down, he read, "After what you told me about Miss Kircher, and knowing that you dislike her, I feel that it is not fair to her and to you that we should impose longer upon you. I know that our presence is keeping you from continuing your journey to the west coast, and so I have decided that it is better for us to try and reach the white settlements immediately without imposing further upon you. We both thank you for your kindness and protection. If there was any way that I might repay the obligation, I feel I should be only too glad to do so." It was signed by Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick. Tarzan shrugged his shoulders, crumpled the note in his hand, and tossed it aside. He felt a certain sense of relief from responsibility and was glad that they had taken the matter out of his hands. They were gone and would forget, but somehow he could not forget. He walked out across the boma and into the clearing. He felt uneasy and restless. Once he started toward the north in response to a sudden determination to continue his way to the west coast. He would follow the winding river toward the north a few miles where its course turned to the west, and then on toward its source across a wooded plateau and up into the foothills and the mountains. Upon the other side of the range he would search for a stream running downward toward the west coast, and thus following the rivers he would be sure of game and water in plenty. But he did not go far. A dozen steps, perhaps, and he came to a sudden stop. "He is an Englishman," he muttered, "and the other is a woman. They can never reach the settlements without my help. I could not kill her with my own hands when I tried, and if I let them go on alone I will have killed her just as surely as though I had run my knife into her heart. No," and again he shook his head. "Tarzan of the Apes is a fool and a weak, old woman," and he turned back toward the south. Manu the monkey had seen the 2 Tarmangani pass 2 days before. Chattering and scolding, he told Tarzan all about it. They had gone in the direction of the village of the Gomangani. That much had Manu seen with his own eyes, so the ape-man swung on through the jungle in a southerly direction, and though with no concentrated effort to follow the spoor of those he trailed. He passed numerous evidences that they had gone this way. Faint suggestions of their scent spoor clung lightly to leaf or branch or bole that one or the other had touched, or in the earth of the trail their feet had trod, and where the way wound through the gloomy depth of dank forest. The impress of their shoes still showed occasionally in the damp mass of decaying vegetation that floored the way. An inexplicable urge spurred Tarzan to increasing speed. The same still, small voice that chided him for having neglected them seemed constantly whispering that they were in dire need of him now. Tarzan's conscience was troubling him, which accounted for the fact that he compared himself to a weak old woman, for the ape-man, reared in savagery and inured to hardships and cruelty, disliked to admit any of the gentler traits that in reality were his birthright. The trail made a detour to the east of the village of the Wamabos, and then returned to the wide elephant path nearer to the river, where it continued in a southerly direction for several miles. At last there came to the ears of the ape-man a peculiar whirring, throbbing sound. For an instant he paused, listening intently. An aeroplane, he muttered, and hastened forward at greatly increased speed. When Tarzan of the Apes finally reached the edge of the meadowland where Smith Oldwick's plane had landed, he took in the entire scene in one quick glance and grasped the situation, although he could scarce give credence to the things he saw. Bound and helpless, the English officer lay upon the ground at one side of the meadow, while around him stood a number of the black deserters from the German command. Tarzan had seen these men before and knew who they were. Coming toward him down the meadow was an aeroplane piloted by the black Usanga, and in the seat behind the pilot was the white girl, Bertha Kircher. How it befell that the ignorant savage could operate the plane, Tarzan could not guess, nor had he time in which to speculate upon the subject. His knowledge of Usanga, together with the position of the white man, told him that the black sergeant was attempting to carry off the white girl. Why he should be doing this when he had her in his power and had also captured and secured the only creature in the jungle who might wish to defend her in so far as the black could know, Tarzan could not guess. For he knew nothing of Usanga's 24 dream wives, nor of the black's fear of the horrid temper of Naratu, his present mate. He did not know then that Usanga had determined to fly away with the white girl, never to return, and to put so great a distance between himself and Naratu that the latter never could find him again. But it was this very thing that was in the black's mind, although not even his own warriors guessed it. He had told them that he would take the captive to a sultan of the north, and there obtain a great price for her, and that when he returned they should have some of the spoils. These things Tarzan did not know. All he knew was what he saw: a Negro attempting to fly away with a white girl. Already the machine was slowly leaving the ground. In a moment more it would rise swiftly out of reach. At first Tarzan thought of fitting an arrow to his bow and slaying Usanga, but as quickly he abandoned the idea because he knew that the moment the pilot was slaying, the machine, running wild, would dash the girl to death among the trees. There was but one way in which he might hope to succor her, away which, if it failed, must send him to instant death, and yet he did not hesitate in an attempt to put it into execution. Usanga did not see him, being too intent upon the unaccustomed duties of a pilot, but the blacks across the meadow saw him, and they ran forward with loud and savage cries and menacing rifles to intercept him. They saw a giant white man leap from the branches of a tree to the turf and race rapidly toward the plain. They saw him take a long grass rope from about his shoulders as he ran. They saw the noose swinging in an undulating circle above his head. They saw the white girl in the machine glance down and discover him. 20 feet above the running ape-man soared the huge plane. The open noose shot up to meet it, and the girl, half guessing the ape-man's intentions, reached out and caught the noose and, bracing herself, clung tightly to it with both hands. Simultaneously, Tarzan was dragged from his feet and the plane lurched sideways in response to the new strain. Usanga clutched wildly at the control and the machine shot upward at a steep angle. Dangling at the end of the rope, the ape-man swung pendulum-like in space. The Englishman, lying bound upon the ground, had been a witness of all these happenings. His heart stood still as he saw Tarzan's body hurtling through the air toward the treetops, among which it seemed he must inevitably crash, but the plane was rising rapidly, so that the beast-man cleared the topmost branches. Then slowly, hand over hand, he climbed toward the fuselage. The girl, clinging desperately to the noose, strained every muscle to hold the great weight dangling at the lower end of the rope. Usanga, all unconscious of what was going on behind him, drove the plane higher and higher into the air. Tarzan glanced downward. Below him the treetops and the river passed rapidly to the rear, and only a slender grass rope and the muscles of a frail girl stood between him and the death yawning there, thousands of feet below. It seemed to Bertha Kircher that the fingers of her hands were dead. The numbness was running up her arms to her elbows. How much longer she could cling to the straining strands she could not guess. It seemed to her that those lifeless fingers must relax at any instant, and then, when she had about given up hope, she saw a strong brown hand reach up and grasp the side of the fuselage. Instantly the weight upon the rope was removed, and a moment later Tarzan of the Apes raised his body above the side and threw a leg over the edge. He glanced forward at Usanga and then, placing his mouth close to the girl's ear, he cried, "Have you ever piloted a plane?" The girl nodded a quick affirmative. "Have you the courage to climb up there beside the black and seize the control while I take care of him?" The girl looked toward Usanga and shuddered. "Yes," she replied, "but my feet are bound." Tarzan drew his hunting knife from its sheath and, reaching down, severed the thongs that bound her ankles. Then the girl unsnapped the strap that held her to her seat. With one hand, Tarzan grasped the girl's arm and steadied her as the two crawled slowly across the few feet which intervened between the two seats. A single slight tip of the plane would have cast them both into eternity. Tarzan realized that only through a miracle of chance could they reach Usanga and effect the change in pilots, and yet he knew that that chance must be taken, for in the brief moments since he had first seen the plane, he had realized that the black was almost without experience as a pilot, and that death surely awaited them in any event should the black sergeant remain at the control. The first intimation Usanga had that all was not well with him was when the girl slipped suddenly to his side and grasped the control, and at the same instant steel-like fingers seized his throat. A brown hand shot down with a keen blade and severed the strap about his waist, and giant muscles lifted him bodily from his seat. Usanga clawed the air and shrieked, but he was helpless as a babe. Far below, the watchers in the meadow could see the aeroplane careening in the sky, for with the change of control it had taken a sudden dive. They saw it right itself and, turning in a short circle, return in their direction, but it was so far above them and the light of the sun so strong that they could see nothing of what was going on within the fuselage. But presently Lieutenant Smith Oldwick gave a gasp of dismay as he saw a human body plunge downward from the plane. Turning and twisting in midair, it fell with ever-increasing velocity, and the Englishman held his breath as the thing hurtled toward them. With a muffled thud it flattened upon the turf near the center of the meadow, and when at last the Englishman could gain the courage to again turn his eyes upon it, he breathed a fervent prayer of thanks, for the shapeless mass that lay upon the blood-stained turf was covered with an ebonite. Usanga had reaped his reward. Again and again the plane circled above the meadow. The blacks, at first dismayed at the death of their leader, were now worked to a frenzy of rage and a determination to be avenged. The girl and the ape-man saw them gather in a knot about the body of their fallen chief. They saw as they circled above the meadow the black fists shaken at them, and the rifles brandishing a menace toward them. Tarzan still clung to the fuselage directly behind the pilot's seat. His face was close beside Bertha Kircher's, and at the top of his voice, above the noise of propeller, engine, and exhaust, he screamed a few words of instruction into her ear. As the girl grasped the significance of his words, she paled. But her lips set in a hard line and her eyes shone with a sudden fire of determination as she dropped the plane to within a few feet of the ground, and at the opposite end of the meadow from the blacks, and then at full speed bore down upon the savages. So quickly the plane came that Usanga's men had no time to escape it after they realized its menace. It touched the ground just as it struck among them, and mowed through them, a veritable juggernaut of destruction. When it came to rest at the edge of the forest, the ape-man leaped quickly to the ground and ran toward the young lieutenant, and as he went he glanced at the spot where the warriors had stood, ready to defend himself if necessary, but there was none there to oppose him. Dead and dying they lay strewn for 50 feet along the turf. By the time Tarzan had freed the Englishman, the girl joined them. She tried to voice her thanks to the ape-man, but he silenced her with a gesture. "You saved yourself," he insisted, "for had you been unable to pilot the plane, I could not have helped you. And now," he said, "you too have the means of returning to the settlements. The day is still young. You can easily cover the distance in a few hours if you have sufficient petrol." He looked inquiringly toward the aviator. Smith Oldwick nodded his head affirmatively. "I have plenty," he replied. "Then go at once," said the ape-man. "Neither of you belong in the jungle." A slight smile touched his lips as he spoke. The girl and the Englishman smiled too. "This jungle is no place for us," at least said Smith Oldwick, "and it is no place for any other white man. Why don't you come back to civilization with us?" Tarzan shook his head. "I prefer the jungle," he said. The aviator dug his toe into the ground and, still looking down, blurted something which he evidently hated to say. If it is a matter of living, old top, he said, money, you know. Tarzan laughed. No, he said, I know what you are trying to say. It is not that. I was born in the jungle. I have lived all my life in the jungle, and I shall die in the jungle. I do not wish to live or die elsewhere. The others shook their heads. They could not understand him. Go, said the ape man. The quicker you go, the quicker you will reach safety. They walked to the plane together. Smith Oldwick pressed the ape man's hand and clambered into the pilot's seat. Goodbye, said the girl as she extended her hand to Tarzan. Before I go, won't you tell me you don't hate me anymore? Tarzan's face clouded. Without a word, he picked her up and lifted her to her place behind the Englishman. An expression of pain crossed Bertha Kircher's face. The motor started, and a moment later the two were being borne rapidly toward the east. In the center of the meadow stood the ape man watching them. It is too bad that she is a German and a spy, he said, for she is very hard to hate. Chapter 14. The Black Lion. Numa the lion was hungry. He had come out of the desert country to the east into a land of plenty, but though he was young and strong, the wary grass-eaters had managed to elude his mighty talons each time he had thought to make a kill. Numa the lion was hungry and very savage. For 2 days he had not eaten, and now he hunted in the ugliest of humors. No more did Numa roar forth a rumbling challenge to the world, but rather he moved silent and grim, stepping softly that no cracking twig might betray his presence to the keen-eared quarry he sought. Fresh was the spoor of Bara the deer that Numa picked up in the well-beaten game trail he was following. No hour had passed since Bara had come this way. The time could be measured in minutes, and so the great lion redoubled the cautiousness of his advance as he crept stealthily in pursuit of his quarry. A light wind was moving through the jungle aisles, and it wafted down now to the nostrils of the eager carnivore the strong scent spoor of the deer, exciting his already avid appetite to a point where it became a gnawing pain. Yet Numa did not permit himself to be carried away by his desires into any premature charge such as had recently lost him the juicy meat of Paco the zebra. Increasing his gait but slightly, he followed the tortuous windings of the trail until suddenly just before him, where the trail wound about the bole of a huge tree, he saw a young buck moving slowly ahead of him. Numa judged the distance with his keen eyes, glowing now like two terrible spots of yellow fire in his wrinkled, snarling face. He could do it this time, he was sure. One terrific roar that would paralyze the poor creature ahead of him into momentary inaction, and a simultaneous charge of lightning-like rapidity, and Numa the lion would feed, the sinuous tail, undulating slowly at its tufted extremity, whipped suddenly erect. It was the signal for the charge, and the vocal organs were shaped for the thunderous roar when, as lightning out of a clear sky, Sheeta, the panther, leapt suddenly into the trail between Numa and the deer. A blundering charge made Sheeta, for with the first crash of his spotted body through the foliage verging the trail, Bara gave a single startled backward glance and was gone. The roar that was intended to paralyze the deer broke horribly from the deep throat of the great cat, an angry roar of rage against the meddling Sheeta who had robbed him of his kill, and the charge that was intended for Bara was launched against the panther. But here too Numa was doomed to disappointment, for with the first notes of his fearsome roar Sheeta, considering well the better part of valor, leaped into a nearby tree. A half-hour later it was a thoroughly furious Numa who came unexpectedly upon the scent of man. Heretofore the lord of the jungle had disdained the unpalatable flesh of the despised man-thing. Such meat was only for the old, the toothless, and the decrepit who no longer could make their kills among the fleet-footed grass-eaters. Bara, the deer, Horta, the boar, and best and wariest Paco, the zebra, were for the young, the strong, and the agile, but Numa was hungrier than he ever had been in the 5 short years of his life. What if he was a young, powerful, cunning, and ferocious beast? In the face of hunger, the great leveler, he was as the old, the toothless, and the decrepit. His belly cried aloud in anguish, and his jowls slavered for flesh. Zebra or deer or man, what mattered it so that it was warm flesh, red with the hot juices of life? Even Dango, the hyena, eater of offal, would at the moment have seemed a tidbit to Numa. The great lion knew the habits and frailties of man, though he never before had hunted man for food. He knew the despised Gomangani as the slowest, the most stupid, and the most defenseless of creatures. No woodcraft, no cunning, no stealth was necessary in the hunting of man, nor had Numa any stomach for either delay or silence. His rage had become an almost equally consuming passion with his hunger, so that now, as his delicate nostrils apprised him of the recent passage of man, he lowered his head and rumbled forth a thunderous roar, and at a swift walk, careless of the noise he made, set forth upon the trail of his intended quarry. Majestic and terrible, regally careless of his surroundings, the king of beasts strode down the beaten trail. The natural caution that is inherent to all creatures of the wild had deserted him. What had he, lord of the jungle, to fear, and with only man to hunt, what need of caution? And so he did not see or scent what a more wary Numa might readily have discovered until, with the cracking of twigs and a tumbling of earth, he was precipitated into a cunningly devised pit that the wily Wamabos had excavated for just this purpose in the center of the game trail. Tarzan of the apes stood in the center of the clearing, watching the plane shrinking to diminutive toy-like proportions in the eastern sky. He had breathed a sigh of relief as he saw it rise safely with the British flyer and Fräulein Bertha Kircher. For weeks he had felt the hampering responsibility of their welfare in this savage wilderness, where their utter helplessness would have rendered them easy prey for the savage carnivores or the cruel Wamabos. Tarzan of the apes loved unfettered freedom, and now that these two were safely off his hands, he felt that he could continue upon his journey toward the west coast and the long untenanted cabin of his dead father. And yet, as he stood there watching the tiny speck in the east, another sigh heaved his broad chest, nor was it a sigh of relief, but rather a sensation which Tarzan had never expected to feel again, and which he now disliked to admit even to himself. It could not be possible that he, the jungle-bred, who had renounced forever the society of man to return to his beloved beasts of the wilds, could be feeling anything akin to regret at the departure of these two, or any slightest loneliness now that they were gone. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick Tarzan had liked, but the woman whom he had known as a German spy he had hated, though he never had found it in his heart to slay her as he had sworn to slay all Huns. He had attributed this weakness to the fact that she was a woman, although he had been rather troubled by the apparent inconsistency of his hatred for her and his repeated protection of her when danger threatened. With an irritable toss of his head, he wheeled suddenly toward the west, as though by turning his back upon the fast-disappearing plane he might expunge thoughts of its passengers from his memory. At the edge of the clearing he paused. A giant tree loomed directly ahead of him, and as though actuated by sudden and irresistible impulse, he leaped into the branches and swung himself with ape-like agility to the topmost limbs that would sustain his weight. There, balancing lightly upon a swaying bough, he sought in the direction of the eastern horizon for the tiny speck that would be the British plane bearing away from him, the last of his own race, and kind that he expected ever again to see. At last his keen eyes picked up the ship flying at a considerable altitude far in the east. For a few seconds he watched it speeding evenly eastward when, to his horror, he saw the speck dive suddenly downward. The fall seemed interminable to the watcher, and he realized how great must have been the altitude of the plane before the drop commenced. Just before it disappeared from sight, its downward momentum appeared to abate suddenly, but it was still moving rapidly at a steep angle when it finally disappeared from view behind the far hills. For half a minute the ape-man stood noting distant landmarks that he judged might be in the vicinity of the fallen plane. For no sooner had he realized that these people were again in trouble than his inherent sense of duty to his own kind impelled him once more to forego his plans and seek to aid them. The ape-man feared, from what he judged of the location of the machine, that it had fallen among the almost impassable gorges of the arid country just beyond the fertile basin that was bounded by the hills to the east of him. He had crossed that parched and desolate country of the dead himself, and he knew from his own experience and the narrow escape he had had from succumbing to its relentless cruelty no lesser man could hope to win his way to safety from any considerable distance within its borders. Vividly he recalled the bleached bones of the long-dead warrior in the bottom of the precipitous gorge that had all but proved a trap for him as well. He saw the helmet of hammered brass and the corroded breastplate of steel and the long straight sword in its scabbard, and the ancient harquebus, mute testimonials to the mighty physique and the warlike spirit of him who had somehow won, thus illy caparisoned and pitifully armed, to the center of savage, ancient Africa, and he saw the slender English youth and the slight figure of the girl cast into the same fateful trap from which this giant of old had been unable to escape, cast there wounded and broken, perhaps if not killed. His judgment told him that the latter possibility was probably the fact, and yet there was a chance that they might have landed without fatal injuries, and so upon this slim chance he started out upon what he knew would be an arduous journey, fraught with many hardships and unspeakable peril, and that he might attempt to save them if they still lived. He had covered a mile perhaps when his quick ears caught the sound of rapid movement along the game trail ahead of him, The sound, increasing in volume, proclaimed the fact that whatever caused it was moving in his direction and moving rapidly. Nor was it long before his trained senses convinced him that the footfalls were those of Bara the deer in rapid flight. Inextricably confused in Tarzan's character were the attributes of man and of beasts. Long experience had taught him that he fights best or travels fastest who is best nourished, and so with few exceptions, Tarzan could delay his most urgent business to take advantage of an opportunity to kill and feed. This perhaps was the predominant beast trait in him, the transformation from an English gentleman, impelled by the most humanitarian motives, to that of a wild beast crouching in the concealment of a dense bush ready to spring upon its approaching prey, was instantaneous. And so when Bara came, escaping the clutches of Numa and Sheeta, his terror and his haste precluded the possibility of his sensing that other equally formidable foe lying in ambush for him. Abreast of the ape-man came the deer, a light brown body shot from the concealing verdure of the bush. Strong arms encircled the sleek neck of the young buck, and powerful teeth fastened themselves in the soft flesh. Together the two rolled over in the trail, and a moment later the ape-man rose, and with one foot upon the carcass of his kill, raised his voice in the victory cry of the bull-ape. Like an answering challenge came suddenly to the ears of the ape-man the thunderous roar of a lion, a hideous angry roar in which Tarzan thought that he discerned a note of surprise and terror. In the breast of the wild things of the jungle, as in the breasts of their more enlightened brothers and sisters of the human race, the characteristic of curiosity is well developed, nor was Tarzan far from innocent of it. The peculiar note in the roar of his hereditary enemy aroused a desire to investigate, and so, throwing the carcass of Bara, the deer, across his shoulder, the ape-man took to the lower terraces of the forest and moved quickly in the direction from which the sound had come, which was in line with the trail he had set out upon. As the distance lessened, the sounds increased in volume, which indicated that he was approaching a very angry lion, and presently, where a jungle giant overspread the broad game trail that countless thousands of hoofed and padded feet had worn and trampled into a deep furrow during perhaps countless ages, he saw beneath him the lion pit of the Wamabos, and in it, leaping futilely for freedom, such a lion as even Tarzan of the Apes never before had beheld. A mighty beast it was that glared up at the ape-man, large, powerful, and young, with a huge black mane and a coat so much darker than any Tarzan ever had seen that, in the depths of the pit, it looked almost black, a black lion. Tarzan, who had been upon the point of taunting and reviling his captive foe, was suddenly turned to open admiration for the beauty of the splendid beast. What a creature! How, by comparison, the ordinary forest lion was dwarfed into insignificance. Here indeed was one worthy to be called king of beasts. With his first sight of the great cat, the ape-man knew that he had heard no note of terror in that initial roar, surprise doubtless, but the vocal cords of that mighty throat never had reacted to fear. With growing admiration came a feeling of quick pity for the hapless situation of the great brute, rendered futile and helpless by the wiles of the Gomangani. Enemy though the beast was, he was less an enemy to the ape-man than those blacks who had trapped him, for though Tarzan of the Apes claimed many fast and loyal friends among certain tribes of African natives, there were others of degraded character and bestial habits that he looked upon with utter loathing, and of such were the human flesh-eaters of Numabao the chief. For a moment Numa the lion glared ferociously at the naked man-thing upon the tree limb above him. Steadily those yellow-green eyes bored into the clear eyes of the ape-man, and then the sensitive nostrils caught the scent of the fresh blood of Bara, and the eyes moved to the carcass lying across the brown shoulder, and there came from the cavernous depths of the savage throat a low whine. Tarzan of the Apes smiled. As unmistakably as though a human voice had spoken, the lion had said to him, "I am hungry, even more than hungry. I am starving." And the ape-man looked down upon the lion beneath him and smiled, a slow, quizzical smile, and then he shifted the carcass from his shoulder to the branch before him, and drawing the long blade that had been his father's, deftly cut off a hind quarter, and, wiping the bloody blade upon Bara's smooth coat, he returned it to its scabbard. Numa, with watering jaws, looked up at the tempting meat and whined again, and the ape-man smiled down upon him his slow smile, and, raising the hind quarter in his strong brown hands, buried his teeth in the tender, juicy flesh. For the third time Numa, the lion, uttered that low, pleading whine, and then, with a rueful and disgusted shake of his head, Tarzan of the Apes raised the balance of the carcass of Bara, the deer, and hurled it to the famished beast below. "Old woman," muttered the ape-man. "Tarzan has become a weak old woman. Presently he would shed tears because he has killed Bara the deer. He cannot see Numa, his enemy, go hungry, because Tarzan's heart is turning to water by contact with the soft, weak creatures of civilization. But yet he smiled, nor was he sorry that he had given way to the dictates of a kindly impulse. As Tarzan tore the flesh from that portion of the kill he had retained for himself, his eyes were taking in each detail of the scene below. He saw the avidity with which Numa devoured the carcass. He noted with growing admiration the finer points of the beast, and also the cunning construction of the trap. The ordinary lion pit with which Tarzan was familiar had stakes embedded in the bottom, upon whose sharpened points the hapless lion would be impaled, but this pit was not so made. Here the short stakes were set at intervals of about a foot around the walls near the top, their sharpened points inclining downward so that the lion had fallen unhurt into the trap, but could not leap out because each time he essayed it his head came in contact with the sharp end of a stake above him. Evidently, then, the purpose of the Wamabos was to capture a lion alive. As this tribe had no contact whatsoever with white men insofar as Tarzan knew, their motive was doubtless due to a desire to torture the beast to death, that they might enjoy to the utmost his dying agonies. Having fed the lion, it presently occurred to Tarzan that his act would be futile were he to leave the beast to the mercies of the blacks, and then, too, it occurred to him that he could derive more pleasure through causing the blacks discomfiture than by leaving Numa to his fate. But how was he to release him? By removing 2 stakes there would be left plenty of room for the lion to leap from the pit, which was not of any great depth. However, what assurance had Tarzan that Numa would not leap out instantly? The way to freedom was open, and before the ape-man could gain the safety of the trees. Regardless of the fact that Tarzan felt no such fear of the lion as you and I might experience under like circumstances, he yet was imbued with the sense of caution that is necessary to all creatures of the wild if they are to survive. Should necessity require, Tarzan could face Numa in battle, although he was not so egotistical as to think that he could best a full-grown lion in mortal combat other than through accident or the utilization of the cunning of his superior man-mind. To lay himself liable to death futilely he would have considered as reprehensible as to have shunned danger in time of necessity, but when Tarzan elected to do a thing he usually found the means to accomplish it. He had now fully determined to liberate Numa, and having so determined he would accomplish it even though it entailed considerable personal risk. He knew that the lion would be occupied with his feeding for some time, but he also knew that while feeding he would be doubly resentful of any fancied interference. Therefore Tarzan must work with caution. Coming to the ground at the side of the pit, he examined the stakes, and as he did so was rather surprised to note that Numa gave no evidence of anger at his approach. Once he turned a searching gaze upon the ape-man for a moment, and then returned to the flesh of Bara. Tarzan felt of the stakes and tested them with his weight. He pulled upon them with the muscles of his strong arms, presently discovering that by working them back and forth he could loosen them, and then a new plan was suggested to him so that he fell to work excavating with his knife at a point above where one of the stakes was embedded. The loam was soft and easily removed, and it was not long until Tarzan had exposed that part of one of the stakes which was embedded in the wall of the pit to almost its entire length, leaving only enough embedded to prevent the stake from falling into the excavation. Then he turned his attention to an adjoining stake and soon had it similarly exposed, after which he threw the noose of his grass rope over the 2 and swung quickly to the branch of the tree above. Here he gathered in the slack of the rope, and bracing himself against the bole of the tree, pulled steadily upward. Slowly the stakes rose from the trench in which they were embedded, and with them rose Numa's suspicion and growling. Was this some new encroachment upon his rights and his liberties? He was puzzled, and like all lions, being short of temper, he was irritated. He had not minded it when the Tarmangani squatted upon the verge of the pit and looked down upon him, for had not this Tarmangani fed him? But now something else was afoot, and the suspicion of the wild beast was aroused. As he watched, however, Numa saw the stakes rise slowly to an erect position, tumble against each other, and then fall backwards out of his sight upon the surface of the ground above. Instantly the lion grasped the possibilities of the situation, and too perhaps he sensed the fact that the man-thing had deliberately opened a way for his escape. Seizing the remains of Bara in his great jaws, Numa, the lion, leaped agilely from the pit of the Wamabos, and Tarzan of the apes melted into the jungles to the east. On the surface of the ground, or through the swaying branches of the trees, the spoor of man or beast was an open book to the ape-man, but even his acute senses were baffled by the spoorless trail of the airship. Of what good were eyes or ears, or the sense of smell in following a thing whose path had lain through the shifting air thousands of feet above the treetops? Only upon his sense of direction could Tarzan depend in his search for the fallen plane. He could not even judge accurately as to the distance it might lie from him, and he knew that from the moment that it disappeared beyond the hills it might have traveled a considerable distance at right angles to its original course before it crashed to earth. If its occupants were killed or badly injured, the ape-man might search futilely in their immediate vicinity for some time before finding them. There was but one thing to do, and that was to travel to a point as close as possible to where he judged the plane had landed, and then to follow in ever-widening circles until he picked up their scent spoor. And this he did. Before he left the Valley of Plenty, he made several kills and carried the choicest cuts of meat with him, leaving all the dead weight of bones behind. The dense vegetation of the jungle terminated at the foot of the western slope, growing less and less abundant as he neared the summit, beyond which was a sparse growth of sickly scrub and sunburned grasses, with here and there a gnarled and hardy tree that had withstood the vicissitudes of an almost waterless existence. From the summit of the hills, Tarzan's keen eyes searched the arid landscape before him. In the distance he discerned the ragged, tortuous lines that marked the winding course of the hideous gorges which scored the broad plain at intervals, the terrible gorges that had so nearly claimed his life in punishment for his temerity in attempting to invade the sanctity of their ancient solitude. For 2 days Tarzan sought futilely for some clue to the whereabouts of the machine or its occupants. He cached portions of his kills at different points, building cairns of rock to mark their locations. He crossed the first deep gorge and circled far beyond it. Occasionally he stopped and called aloud, listening for some response, but only silence rewarded him, a sinister silence that his cries only accentuated. Late in the evening of the second day he came to the well-remembered gorge in which lay the clean-picked bones of the ancient adventurer, and here for the first time Ska, the vulture, picked up his trail. "Not this time, Ska," cried the ape-man in a taunting voice, "for now indeed is Tarzan Tarzan. Before you stalked the grim skeleton of a Tarmangani, and even then you lost. Waste not your time upon Tarzan of the Apes in the full of his strength." But still Ska, the vulture, circled and soared above him, and the ape-man, notwithstanding his boasts, felt a shudder of apprehension. Through his brain ran a persistent and doleful chant to which he involuntarily set 2 words, repeated over and over again in horrible monotony: "Ska knows. Ska knows," until, shaking himself in anger, he picked up a rock and hurled it at the grim scavenger. Lowering himself over the precipitous side of the gorge, Tarzan half clambered and half slid to the sandy floor beneath. He had come upon the rift at almost the exact spot at which he had clambered from it weeks before, and there he saw, just as he had left it, just doubtless as it had lain for centuries, the mighty skeleton and its mighty armor. As he stood looking down upon this grim reminder that another man of might had succumbed to the cruel powers of the desert, he was brought to startled attention by the report of a firearm, the sound of which came from the depths of the gorge to the south of him, and reverberated along the steep walls of the narrow rift. Chapter 15. Mysterious Footprints. As the British plane, piloted by Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, rose above the jungle wilderness where Bertha Kircher's life had so often been upon the point of extinction, and sped toward the east, the girl felt a sudden contraction of the muscles of her throat. She tried very hard to swallow something that was not there. It seemed strange to her that she should feel regret in leaving behind her such hideous perils, and yet it was plain to her that such was the fact, for she was also leaving behind something beside the dangers that had menaced her, a unique figure that had entered her life, and for which she felt an unaccountable attraction. Before her in the pilot's seat sat an English officer and gentleman whom she knew loved her, and yet she dared to feel regret in his company at leaving the stamping ground of a wild beast. Lieutenant Smith Oldwick, on his part, was in the 7th heaven of elation. He was in possession again of his beloved ship. He was flying swiftly in the direction of his comrades and his duty, and with him was the woman he loved. The fly in the ointment, however, was the accusation Tarzan had made against this woman. He had said that she was a German and a spy, and from the heights of bliss the English officer was occasionally plunged to the depths of despair in contemplation of the inevitable, were the ape-man's charges to prove true. He found himself torn between sentiments of love and honor. On the one hand, he could not surrender the woman he loved to the certain fate that must be meted out to her if she were in truth an enemy spy, while on the other it would be equally impossible for him as an Englishman and an officer to give her aid or protection. The young man contented himself therefore with repeated mental denials of her guilt. He tried to convince himself that Tarzan was mistaken, and when he conjured upon the screen of recollection the face of the girl behind him, he was doubly reassured that those lines of sweet femininity and character, those clear and honest eyes, could not belong to one of the hated alien race. And so they sped toward the east, each wrapped in his own thoughts. Below them they saw the dense vegetation of the jungle give place to the scantier growth upon the hillside, and then before them there spread the wide expanse of arid wastelands marked by the deep scarring of the narrow gorges that long-gone rivers had cut there in some forgotten age. Shortly after they passed the summit of the ridge which formed the boundary between the desert and the fertile country, Ska, the vulture, winging his way at a high altitude toward his eyrie, caught sight of a strange new bird of gigantic proportions encroaching upon the preserves of his aerial domain. Whether with intent to give battle to the interloper or merely impelled by curiosity, Ska rose suddenly upward to meet the plane. Doubtless he misjudged the speed of the newcomer, but be that as it may, the tip of the propeller blade touched him and simultaneously many things happened. The lifeless body of Ska, torn and bleeding, dropped plummet-like toward the ground. A bit of splintered spruce drove backward to strike the pilot on the forehead. The plane shuddered and trembled, and as Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick sank forward in momentary unconsciousness, the ship dived headlong toward the earth. Only for an instant was the pilot unconscious, but that instant almost proved their undoing. When he awoke to a realization of their peril, it was also to discover that his motor had stalled. The plane had attained frightful momentum, and the ground seemed too close for him to hope to flatten out in time to make a safe landing. Directly beneath him was a deep rift in the plateau, a narrow gorge, the bottom of which appeared comparatively level and sand-covered. In the brief instant in which he must reach a decision, the safest plan seemed to attempt a landing in the gorge, and this he did, but not without considerable damage to the plane and a severe shaking up for himself and his passenger. Fortunately, neither of them was injured, but their condition seemed indeed a hopeless one. It was a grave question as to whether the man could repair his plane and continue the journey, and it seemed equally questionable as to their ability either to proceed on foot to the coast or retrace their way to the country they had just left. The man was confident that they could not hope to cross the desert country to the east in the face of thirst and hunger, while behind them in the Valley of Plenty lay almost equal danger in the form of carnivores and the warlike natives. After the plane came to its sudden and disastrous stop, Smith Oldwick turned quickly to see what the effect of the accident had been on the girl. He found her pale but smiling, and for several seconds the two sat looking at each other in silence. "This is the end?" the girl asked. The Englishman shook his head. "It is the end of the first leg anyway," he replied. "But you can't hope to make repairs here," she said dubiously. "No," he said, "not if they amount to anything, but I may be able to patch it up. I will have to look her over a bit first. Let us hope there is nothing serious. It's a long, long way to the Tanga Railway." "We would not get far," said the girl, a slight note of hopelessness in her tone. "Entirely unarmed as we are, it would be little less than a miracle if we covered even a small fraction of the distance." "But we are not unarmed," replied the man. "I have an extra pistol here that the beggars didn't discover," and removing the cover of a compartment he drew forth an automatic. Bertha Kircher leaned back in her seat and laughed aloud, a mirthless, half-hysterical laugh. "That pop gun," she exclaimed. "What earthly good would it do other than to infuriate any beast of prey you might happen to hit with it?" Smith Oldwick looked rather crestfallen. "But it is a weapon," he said. "You will have to admit that, and certainly I could kill a man with it." "You could, if you happened to hit him," said the girl, "or the thing didn't jam. Really, I haven't much faith in an automatic. I have used them myself." "Oh, of course," he said ironically, "an express rifle would be better, for who knows but we might meet an elephant here in the desert." The girl saw that he was hurt, and she was sorry, for she realized that there was nothing he would not do in her service or protection, and that it was through no fault of his that he was so illy armed. Doubtless, too, he realized as well as she the futility of his weapon, and that he had only called attention to it in the hope of reassuring her and lessening her anxiety. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to be nasty, but this accident is the proverbial last straw. It seems to me that I have borne all that I can. Though I was willing to give my life in the service of my country, I did not imagine that my death agonies would be so long drawn out. For I realize now that I have been dying for many weeks." "What do you mean?" he exclaimed. "What do you mean by that? You are not dying. There is nothing the matter with you." "Oh, not that." She said, "I did not mean that. What I mean is that at the moment the black sergeant, Usanga, and his renegade German native troops captured me and brought me inland. My death warrant was signed. Sometimes I have imagined that a reprieve has been granted. Sometimes I have hoped that I might be upon the verge of winning a full pardon, but really in the depths of my heart I have known that I should never live to regain civilization. I have done my bit for my country, and though it was not much, I can at least go with the realization that it was the best I was able to offer. All that I can hope for now, all that I ask for, is a speedy fulfillment of the death sentence. I do not wish to linger any more to face constant terror and apprehension. Even physical torture would be preferable to what I have passed through. I have no doubt that you consider me a brave woman, but really my terror has been boundless. The cries of the carnivores at night fill me with a dread so tangible that I am in actual pain. I feel the rending talons in my flesh and the cruel fangs munching upon my bones. It is as real to me as though I were actually enduring the horrors of such a death. I doubt if you can understand it. Men are so different. Yes, he said, I think I can understand it, and because I understand I can appreciate more than you imagine the heroism you have shown in your endurance of all that you have passed through. There can be no bravery where there is no fear. A child might walk into a lion's den, but it would take a very brave man to go to its rescue. Thank you, she said, but I am not brave at all, and now I am very much ashamed of my thoughtlessness for your own feelings. I will try and take a new grip upon myself, and we will both hope for the best. I will help you all I can if you will tell me what I may do. The first thing, he replied, is to find out just how serious our damage is, and then to see what we can do in the way of repairs. For 2 days Smith Oldwick worked upon the damaged plane, worked in the face of the fact that, from the first, he realized the case was hopeless, and at last he told her. I knew it, she said, but I believe that I felt much as you must have, that, however futile our efforts here might be, it would be infinitely as fatal to attempt to retrace our way to the jungle we just left, or to go on toward the coast. You know, and I know that we could not reach the Tanga Railway on foot. We should die of thirst and starvation before we had covered half the distance. And if we returned to the jungle, even were we able to reach it, it would be but to court an equally certain, though different, fate. So we might as well sit here and wait for death as to uselessly waste our energies in what we know would be a futile attempt at escape, he asked. No, she replied, I shall never give up like that. What I meant was that it was useless to attempt to reach either of the places where we know that there is food and water in abundance, so we must strike out in a new direction. Somewhere there may be water in this wilderness, and if there is, the best chance of our finding it would be to follow this gorge downward. We have enough food and water left if we are careful of it. For a couple of days, and in that time we might stumble upon a spring, or possibly even reach the fertile country which I know lies to the south. When Usanga brought me to the Wamabo country from the coast, he took a southerly route along which there was usually water and game in plenty. It was not until we neared our destination that the country became overrun with carnivores, so there is hope if we can reach the fertile country south of us that we can manage to pull through to the coast. The man shook his head dubiously. We can try it, he said. Personally, I do not fancy sitting here waiting for death. Smith Oldwick was leaning against the ship, his dejected gaze directed upon the ground at his feet. The girl was looking south down the gorge in the direction of their one slender chance of life. Suddenly she touched him on the arm. Look, she whispered. The man raised his eyes quickly in the direction of her gaze to see the massive head of a great lion who was regarding them from beyond a rocky projection at the first turning of the gorge. Phew, he exclaimed, the beggars are everywhere. They do not go far from water, do they? Asked the girl hopefully. I should imagine not, he replied. A lion is not particularly strong on endurance. Then he is a harbinger of hope, she exclaimed. The man laughed. Cute little harbinger of hope, he said. Reminds me of Cock Robin heralding spring. The girl cast a quick glance at him. Don't be silly, and I don't care if you do laugh. He fills me with hope. It is probably mutual, replied Smith Oldwick, as we doubtless fill him with hope. The lion, evidently having satisfied himself as to the nature of the creatures before him, advanced slowly now in their direction. Come, said the man, let's climb aboard, and he helped the girl over the side of the ship. Can't he get in here? She asked. I think he can, said the man. You are reassuring, she returned. I don't feel so. He drew his pistol. For heaven's sake, she cried, don't shoot at him with that thing, you might hit him. I don't intend to shoot at him, but I might succeed in frightening him away if he attempts to reach us here. Haven't you ever seen a trainer work with lions? He carries a silly little pop gun loaded with blank cartridges. With that and a kitchen chair, he subdues the most ferocious of beasts. But you haven't a kitchen chair, she reminded him. No, he said, government is always muddling things. I have always maintained that airplanes should be equipped with kitchen chairs. Bertha Kircher laughed as evenly and with as little hysteria as though she were moved by the small talk of an afternoon tea. Numa, the lion, came steadily toward them. His attitude seemed more that of curiosity than of belligerency. Close to the side of the ship, he stopped and stood gazing up at them. Magnificent, isn't he? Exclaimed the man. I never saw a more beautiful creature, she replied, nor one with such a dark coat. Why, he is almost black. The sound of their voices seemed not to please the lord of the jungle, for he suddenly wrinkled his great face into deep furrows as he bared his fangs beneath snarling lips and gave vent to an angry growl. Almost simultaneously he crouched for a spring, and immediately Smith Oldwick discharged his pistol into the ground in front of the lion. The effect of the noise upon Numa seemed but to enrage him further, and with a horrid roar he sprang for the author of the new and disquieting sound that had outraged his ears. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick vaulted nimbly out of the cockpit on the opposite side of his plane, calling to the girl to follow his example. The girl, realizing the futility of leaping to the ground, chose the remaining alternative and clambered to the top of the upper plane. Numa, unaccustomed to the idiosyncrasies of construction of an airship and having gained the forward cockpit, watched the girl clamber out of his reach without at first endeavoring to prevent her. Having taken possession of the plane, his anger seemed suddenly to leave him, and he made no immediate move toward following Smith Oldwick. The girl, realizing the comparative safety of her position, had crawled to the outer edge of the wing, and was calling to the man to try and reach the opposite end of the upper plane. It was this scene upon which Tarzan of the Apes looked as he rounded the bend of the gorge above the plane after the pistol shot had attracted his attention. The girl was so intent upon watching the efforts of the Englishman to reach a place of safety, and the latter was so busily occupied in attempting to do so, that neither at once noticed the silent approach of the ape-man. It was Numa who first noticed the intruder. The lion immediately evinced his displeasure by directing toward him a snarling countenance and a series of warning growls. His action called the attention of the two upon the upper plane to the newcomer, eliciting a stifled "thank God" from the girl, even though she could scarce credit the evidence of her own eyes that it was indeed the savage man, whose presence always assured her safety, who had come so providentially in the nick of time. Almost immediately both were horrified to see Numa leap from the cockpit and advance upon Tarzan. The ape-man, carrying his stout spear in readiness, moved deliberately onward to meet the carnivore, which he had recognized as the lion of the Wamabos pit. He knew from the manner of Numa's approach what neither Bertha Kircher nor Smith Oldwick knew, that there was more of curiosity than belligerency in it, and he wondered if in that great head there might not be a semblance of gratitude for the kindness that Tarzan had done him. There was no question in Tarzan's mind but that Numa recognized him, for he knew his fellows of the jungle well enough to know that while they oft times forgot certain sensations more quickly than man, there are others which remain in their memories for years. A well-defined scent spoor might never be forgotten by a beast if it had first been sensed under unusual circumstances, and so Tarzan was confident that Numa's nose had already reminded him of all the circumstances of their brief connection. Love of the sporting chance is inherent in the Anglo-Saxon race, and it was not now Tarzan of the Apes, but rather John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, who smilingly welcomed the sporting chance which he must take to discover how far-reaching was Numa's gratitude. Smith Oldwick and the girl saw the two nearing each other. The former swore softly beneath his breath, while he nervously fingered the pitiful weapon at his hip. The girl pressed her open palms to her cheeks as she leaned forward in stony-eyed, horror-stricken silence. While she had every confidence in the prowess of the godlike creature who thus dared brazenly to face the king of beasts, she had no false conception of what must certainly happen when they met. She had seen Tarzan battle with Cheetah the panther, and she had realized then that, powerful as the man was, it was only agility, cunning, and chance that placed him upon anywhere near an equal footing with his savage adversary, and that of the three factors upon his side chance was the greatest. She saw the man and the lion stop simultaneously, not more than a yard apart. She saw the beast's tail whipping from side to side, and she could hear his deep-throated growls rumbling from his cavernous breast, but she could read correctly neither the movement of the lashing tail nor the notes of the growl. To her, they seemed to indicate nothing but bestial rage, while to Tarzan of the apes they were conciliatory and reassuring in the extreme. And then she saw Numa move forward again until his nose touched the man's naked leg, and she closed her eyes and covered them with her palms. For what seemed an eternity, she waited for the horrid sound of the conflict which she knew must come, but all she heard was an explosive sigh of relief from Smith Oldwick and a half-hysterical "by Jove, just fancy it." She looked up to see the great lion rubbing his shaggy head against the man's hip, and Tarzan's free hand entangled in the black mane, as he scratched Numa, the lion, behind a back-laid ear. Strange friendships are often formed between the lower animals of different species, but less often between man and the savage Felidae, because of the former's inherent fear of the great cats. And so, after all, therefore the friendship so suddenly developed between the savage lion and the savage man was not inexplicable. As Tarzan approached, the plain Numa walked at his side, and when Tarzan stopped and looked up at the girl and the man, Numa stopped also. "I had about given up hope of finding you," said the ape man, "and it is evident that I found you just in time." "But how did you know we were in trouble?" asked the English officer. "I saw your plane fall," replied Tarzan. "I was watching you from a tree beside the clearing where you took off. I didn't have much to locate you by other than the general direction. But it seems that you volplaned a considerable distance toward the south after you disappeared from my view behind the hills. I have been looking for you further toward the north. I was just about to turn back when I heard your pistol shot. Is your ship beyond repair?" "Yes," replied Smith Oldwick. "It is hopeless." "What are your plans, then? What do you wish to do?" Tarzan directed his question to the girl. "We want to reach the coast," she said, "but it seems impossible now." "I should have thought so a little while ago," replied the ape man. "But if Numa is here, there must be water within a reasonable distance. I ran across this lion 2 days ago in the Wamabo country. I liberated him from one of their pits. To have reached this spot, he must have come by some trail unknown to me. At least I crossed no game trail and no spoor of any animal after I came over the hills out of the fertile country. From which direction did he come upon you?" "It was from the south," replied the girl. "We thought, too, that there must be water in that direction." "Let's find out then," said Tarzan. "But how about the lion?" asked Smith Oldwick. "That we will have to discover," replied the ape man, "and we can only do so if you will come down from your perch." The officer shrugged his shoulders. The girl turned her gaze upon him to note the effect of Tarzan's proposal. The Englishman grew suddenly very white, but there was a smile upon his lips as without a word he slipped over the edge of the plane and clambered to the ground behind Tarzan. Bertha Kircher realized that the man was afraid, nor did she blame him, and she also realized the remarkable courage that he had shown in thus facing a danger that was very real to him. Numa, standing close to Tarzan's side, raised his head and glared at the young Englishman, growled once, and looked up at the ape man. Tarzan retained a hold upon the beast's mane and spoke to him in the language of the great apes. To the girl and Smith Oldwick, the growling gutturals falling from human lips sounded uncanny in the extreme, but whether Numa understood them or not, they appeared to have the desired effect upon him, as he ceased growling, and as Tarzan walked to Smith Oldwick's side, Numa accompanied him. Nor did he offer to molest the officer. "What did you say to him?" asked the girl. Tarzan smiled. "I told him," he replied, "that I am Tarzan of the apes, mighty hunter, killer of beasts, lord of the jungle, and that you are my friends. I have never been sure that all of the other beasts understand the language of the Mangani. I know that Manu, the monkey, speaks nearly the same tongue, and I am sure that Tantor, the elephant, understands all that I say to him. We of the jungle are great boasters. In our speech, in our carriage, in every detail of our demeanor, we must impress others with our physical power and our ferocity. That is why we growl at our enemies. We are telling them to beware, or we shall fall upon them and tear them to pieces. Perhaps Numa does not understand the words that I use, but I believe that my tones and my manner carry the impression that I wish them to convey. Now you may come down and be introduced." It required all the courage that Bertha Kircher possessed to lower herself to the ground within reach of the talons and fangs of this untamed forest beast, but she did it. Nor did Numa do more than bare his teeth and growl a little as she came close to the ape man. "I think you are safe from him as long as I am present," said the ape man. "The best thing to do is simply to ignore him. Make no advances, but be sure to give no indication of fear, and if possible always keep me between you and him. He will go away presently, I am sure, and the chances are that we shall not see him again." At Tarzan's suggestion, Smith Oldwick removed the remaining water and provisions from the plane, and distributing the burden among them, they set off toward the south. Numa did not follow them, but stood by the plane watching until they finally disappeared from view around a bend in the gorge. Tarzan had picked up Numa's trail with the intention of following it southward in the belief that it would lead to water. In the sand that floored the bottom of the gorge, tracks were plain and easily followed. At first only the fresh tracks of Numa were visible, but later in the day, the ape-man discovered the older tracks of other lions, and just before dark he stopped suddenly in evident surprise. His two companions looked at him questioningly, and in answer to their implied interrogations he pointed at the ground directly in front of him. "Look at those," he exclaimed. At first neither Smith Oldwick nor the girl saw anything but a confusion of intermingled prints of padded feet in the sand, but presently the girl discovered what Tarzan had seen, and an exclamation of surprise broke from her lips. "The imprint of human feet," she cried. Tarzan nodded. "But there are no toes," the girl pointed out. "The feet were shod with a soft sandal," explained Tarzan. "Then there must be a native village somewhere in the vicinity," said Smith Oldwick. "Yes," replied the ape-man, "but not the sort of natives which we would expect to find here in this part of Africa, where others all go unshod with the exception of a few of Usanga's renegade German native troops who wear German army shoes. I don't know that you can notice it, but it is evident to me that the foot inside the sandal that made these imprints were not the foot of a Negro. If you will examine them carefully, you will notice that the impression of the heel and ball of the foot are well marked even through the sole of the sandal. The weight comes more nearly, or in the center of a Negro's footprint." "Then you think these were made by a white person?" "It looks that way," replied Tarzan, and suddenly, to the surprise of both the girl and Smith Oldwick, he dropped to his hands and knees and sniffed at the tracks again, a beast utilizing the senses and woodcraft of a beast. Over an area of several square yards, his keen nostrils sought the identity of the makers of the tracks. At length he rose to his feet. "It is not the spoor of the Gomangani," he said, "nor is it exactly like that of white men. There were 3 who came this way. They were men, but of what race I do not know." There was no apparent change in the nature of the gorge, except that it had steadily grown deeper as they followed it downward, until now the rocky and precipitous sides rose far above them. At different points, natural caves, which appeared to have been eroded by the action of water in some forgotten age, pitted the side walls at various heights. Near them was such a cavity at the ground's level, an arched cavern floored with white sand. Tarzan indicated it with a gesture of his hand. "We will lair here tonight," he said, and then with one of his rare, slow smiles, "We will camp here tonight." Having eaten their meager supper, Tarzan bade the girl enter the cavern. "You will sleep inside," he said. "The lieutenant and I will lie outside at the entrance." Chapter 16. The Night Attack. As the girl turned to bid them good night, she thought that she saw a shadowy form moving in the darkness beyond them, and almost simultaneously she was sure that she heard the sounds of stealthy movement in the same direction. "What is that?" she whispered. "There is something out there in the darkness." "Yes," replied Tarzan, "it is a lion. It has been there for some time. Hadn't you noticed it before?" "Oh," cried the girl, breathing a sigh of relief. "Is it our lion?" "No," said Tarzan. "It is not our lion, it is another lion, and he is hunting." "He is stalking us?" asked the girl. "He is," replied the ape-man. Smith Oldwick fingered the grip of his pistol. Tarzan saw the involuntary movement and shook his head. "Leave that thing where it is, Lieutenant," he said. The officer laughed nervously. "I couldn't help it. Old man," he said, "instinct of self-preservation and all that." "It would prove an instinct of self-destruction," said Tarzan. "There are at least 3 hunting lions out there watching us. If we had a fire or the moon were up, you would see their eyes plainly. Presently they may come after us, but the chances are that they will not. If you are very anxious that they should, fire your pistol and hit one of them." "What if they do charge?" asked the girl. "There is no means of escape." "Why, we should have to fight them," replied Tarzan. "What chance would we 3 have against them?" asked the girl. The ape-man shrugged his shoulders. "One must die sometime," he said. To you doubtless it may seem terrible such a death, but Tarzan of the Apes has always expected to go out in some such way. Few of us die of old age in the jungle, nor should I care to die thus. Someday Numa will get me, or Sheeta, or a black warrior. These or some of the others. What difference does it make which it is, or whether it comes tonight or next year or in 10 years? After it is over, it will be all the same. The girl shuddered. Yes, she said in a dull, hopeless voice, after it is over, it will be all the same. Then she went into the cavern and lay down upon the sand. Smith Oldwick sat in the entrance and leaned against the cliff. Tarzan squatted on the opposite side. "May I smoke?" questioned the officer of Tarzan. "I have been hoarding a few cigarettes, and if it won't attract those bouncers out there, I would like to have one last smoke before I cash in. Will you join me?" And he proffered the ape man a cigarette. "No, thanks," said Tarzan, "but it will be all right if you smoke. No wild animal is particularly fond of the fumes of tobacco, so it certainly won't entice them any closer." Smith Oldwick lighted his cigarette and sat puffing slowly upon it. He had proffered one to the girl, but she had refused, and thus they sat in silence for some time, the silence of the night ruffled occasionally by the faint crunching of padded feet upon the soft sands of the gorge's floor. It was Smith Oldwick who broke the silence. "Aren't they unusually quiet for lions?" he asked. "No," replied the ape man, "the lion that goes roaring around the jungle does not do it to attract prey. They are very quiet when they are stalking their quarry." "I wish they would roar," said the officer. "I wish they would do anything, even charge. Just knowing that they are there and occasionally seeing something like a shadow in the darkness and the faint sounds that come to us from them are getting on my nerves. But I hope," he said, "that all three don't charge at once." "3," said Tarzan. "There are 7 of them out there now." "Good Lord," exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "Couldn't we build a fire?" asked the girl, "and frighten them away?" "I don't know that it would do any good," said Tarzan, "as I have an idea that these lions are a little different from any that we are familiar with, and possibly for the same reason which, at first puzzled me a little, I refer to the apparent docility in the presence of a man of the lion who was with us today. A man is out there now with those lions." "It is impossible," exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "They would tear him to pieces." "What makes you think there is a man there?" asked the girl. Tarzan smiled and shook his head. "I am afraid you would not understand," he replied. "It is difficult for us to understand anything that is beyond our own powers." "What do you mean by that?" asked the officer. "Well," said Tarzan, "if you had been born without eyes, you could not understand sense impressions that the eyes of others transmit to their brains, and as you have both been born without any sense of smell, I am afraid you cannot understand how I can know that there is a man there." "You mean that you sent a man?" asked the girl. Tarzan nodded affirmatively. "And in the same way you know the number of lions?" asked the man. "Yes," said Tarzan. "No 2 lions look alike, no 2 have the same scent." The young Englishman shook his head. "No," he said, "I cannot understand." "I doubt if the lions or the man are here necessarily for the purpose of harming us," said Tarzan, "because there has been nothing to prevent their doing so long before had they wished to. I have a theory, but it is utterly preposterous." "What is it?" asked the girl. "I think they are here," replied Tarzan, "to prevent us from going some place that they do not wish us to go. In other words, we are under surveillance, and possibly as long as we don't go where we are not wanted, we shall not be bothered." "But how are we to know where they don't want us to go?" asked Smith Oldwick. "We can't know," replied Tarzan, "and the chances are that the very place we are seeking is the place they don't wish us to trespass on." "You mean the water?" asked the girl. "Yes," replied Tarzan. For some time they sat in silence, which was broken only by an occasional sound of movement from the outer darkness. It must have been an hour later that the ape-man rose quietly and drew his long blade from its sheath. Smith Oldwick was dozing against the rocky wall of the cavern entrance, while the girl, exhausted by the excitement and fatigue of the day, had fallen into deep slumber. An instant after Tarzan arose, Smith Oldwick and the girl were aroused by a volley of thunderous roars and the noise of many padded feet rushing toward them. Tarzan of the Apes stood directly before the entrance to the cavern, his knife in his hand, awaiting the charge. The ape-man had not expected any such concerted action as he now realized had been taken by those watching them. He had known for some time that other men had joined those who were with the lions earlier in the evening, and when he arose to his feet it was because he knew that the lions and the men were moving cautiously closer to him and his party. He might easily have eluded them, for he had seen that the face of the cliff rising above the mouth of the cavern might be scaled by as good a climber as himself. It might have been wiser had he tried to escape, for he knew that in the face of such odds even he was helpless, but he stood his ground, though I doubt if he could have told why. He owed nothing either of duty or friendship to the girl sleeping in the cavern, nor could he longer be of any protection to her or her companion, yet something held him there in futile self-sacrifice. The great Tarmangani had not even the satisfaction of striking a blow in self-defense. A veritable avalanche of savage beasts rolled over him and threw him heavily to the ground. In falling, his head struck the rocky surface of the cliff, stunning him. It was daylight when he regained consciousness. The first dim impression borne to his awakening mind was a confusion of savage sounds which gradually resolved themselves into the growling of lions, and then, little by little, there came back to him the recollections of what had preceded the blow that had felled him. Strong in his nostrils was the scent of Numa the lion, and against one naked leg he could feel the coat of some animal. Slowly Tarzan opened his eyes. He was lying on his side, and as he looked down his body he saw that a great lion stood straddling him, a great lion who growled hideously at something which Tarzan could not see. With the full return of his senses, Tarzan's nose told him that the beast above him was Numa of the Wamabo pit. Thus reassured, the ape-man spoke to the lion, and at the same time made a motion as though he would arise. Immediately Numa stepped from above him. As Tarzan raised his head, he saw that he still lay where he had fallen before the opening of the cliff, where the girl had been sleeping, and that Numa, backed against the cliffside, was apparently defending him from two other lions who paced to and fro a short distance from their intended victim. And then Tarzan turned his eyes into the cave and saw that the girl and Smith Oldwick were gone. His efforts had been for naught. With an angry toss of his head, the ape-man turned upon the two lions who had continued to pace back and forth a few yards from him. Numa of the lion pit turned a friendly glance in Tarzan's direction, rubbed his head against the ape-man's side, and then directed his snarling countenance toward the two hunters. "I think," said Tarzan to Numa, "that you and I together can make these beasts very unhappy." He spoke in English, which of course Numa did not understand at all, but there must have been something reassuring in the tone, for Numa whined pleadingly and moved impatiently to and fro parallel with their antagonists. "Come," said Tarzan suddenly, and grasping the lion's mane with his left hand he moved toward the other lions, his companion pacing at his side. As the two advanced, the others drew slowly back, and finally separating, moved off to either side. Tarzan and Numa passed between them, but neither the great black-maned lion nor the man failed to keep an eye upon the beast nearer him, so that they were not caught unawares when, as though at some preconcerted signal, the two cats charged simultaneously from opposite directions. The ape-man met the charge of his antagonist after the same fashion of fighting that he had been accustomed to employing in previous encounters with Numa and Sheeta. To have attempted to meet the full shock of a lion's charge would have been suicidal even for the giant Tarmangani. Instead, he resorted to methods of agility and cunning, for quick as are the great cats, even quicker is Tarzan of the apes. With outspread, raking talons and bared fangs, Numa sprang for the naked chest of the ape-man. Throwing up his left arm as a boxer might ward off a blow, Tarzan struck upward beneath the left forearm of the lion, at the same time rushing in with his shoulder beneath the animal's body, and simultaneously drove his blade into the tawny hide behind the shoulder. With a roar of pain, Numa wheeled again, the personification of bestial rage. Now indeed would he exterminate this presumptuous man-thing who dared even to think that he could thwart the king of beasts in his desires. But as he wheeled, his intended quarry wheeled with him, brown fingers locked in the heavy mane on the powerful neck, and again the blade struck deep into the lion's side. Then it was that Numa went mad with hate and pain, and at the same instant the ape-man leaped full upon his back. Easily before had Tarzan locked his legs beneath the belly of a lion while he clung to its long mane and stabbed it until his point reached its heart. So easy it had seemed before that he experienced a sharp feeling of resentment that he was unable to do so now, for the quick movements of the lion prevented him, and presently, to his dismay, as the lion leaped and threw him about, the ape-man realized that he was swinging inevitably beneath those frightful talons. With a final effort he threw himself from Numa's back and sought, by his quickness, to elude the frenzied beast for the fraction of an instant that would permit him to regain his feet and meet the animal again upon a more even footing. But this time Numa was too quick for him, and he was but partially up when a great paw struck him on the side of the head and bowled him over. As he fell, he saw a black streak shoot above him, and another lion close upon his antagonist. Rolling from beneath the two battling lions, Tarzan regained his feet, though he was half dazed and staggering from the impact of the terrible blow he had received. Behind him he saw a lifeless lion lying torn and bleeding upon the sand, and before him Numa of the pit was savagely mauling the second lion. He of the black coat tremendously outclassed his adversary in point of size and strength as well as in ferocity. The battling beasts made a few feints and passes at each other before the larger succeeded in fastening his fangs in the other's throat, and then, as a cat shakes a mouse, the larger lion shook the lesser, and when his dying foe sought to roll beneath and rake his conqueror with his hind claws, the other met him halfway at his own game, and as the great talons buried themselves in the lower part of the other's chest and then were raked downward with all the terrific strength of the mighty hind legs, the battle was ended. As Numa rose from his second victim and shook himself, Tarzan could not but again note the wondrous proportions and symmetry of the beast. The lions they had bested were splendid specimens themselves, and in their coats Tarzan noted a suggestion of the black which was such a strongly marked characteristic of Numa of the pit. Their mans were just a trifle darker than an ordinary black-maned lion, but the tawny shade on the balance of their coats predominated. However, the ape-man realized that they were a distinct species from any he had seen, as though they had sprung originally from a cross between the forest lion of his acquaintance and a breed of which Numa of the pit might be typical. The immediate obstruction in his way having been removed, Tarzan was for setting out in search of the spoor of the girl and Smith Oldwick, that he might discover their fate. He suddenly found himself tremendously hungry, and as he circled about over the sandy bottom searching among the tangled network of innumerable tracks for those of his protégés, there broke from his lips involuntarily the whine of a hungry beast. Immediately Numa of the pit pricked up his ears, and regarding the ape-man steadily for a moment, he answered the call of hunger and started briskly off toward the south, stopping occasionally to see if Tarzan was following. The ape-man realized that the beast was leading him to food, and so he followed, and as he followed, his keen eyes and sensitive nostrils sought for some indication of the direction taken by the man and the girl. Presently, out of the mass of lion tracks, Tarzan picked up those of many sandaled feet, and the scent spoor of the members of the strange race, such as had been with the lions the night before, and then faintly he caught the scent spoor of the girl, and a little later that of Smith Oldwick. Presently the tracks thinned, and here those of the girl and the Englishman became well marked. They had been walking side by side, and there had been men and lions to the right and left of them, and men and lions in front and behind. The ape-man was puzzled by the possibilities suggested by the tracks, but in the light of any previous experience he could not explain satisfactorily to himself what his perceptions indicated. There was little change in the formation of the gorge. It still wound its erratic course between precipitous cliffs. In places it widened out, and again it became very narrow and always deeper the further south they traveled. Presently the bottom of the gorge began to slope more rapidly. Here and there were indications of ancient rapids and waterfalls. The trail became more difficult, but was well marked and showed indications of great antiquity, and in places the handiwork of man. They had proceeded for a half or 3/4 of a mile when, at a turning of the gorge, Tarzan saw before him a narrow valley cut deep into the living rock of the earth's crust, with lofty mountain ranges bounding it upon the south. How far it extended east and west he could not see, but apparently it was no more than 3 or 4 miles across from north to south. That it was a well-watered valley was indicated by the wealth of vegetation that carpeted its floor from the rocky cliffs upon the north to the mountains on the south. Over the edge of the cliffs from which the ape-man viewed the valley a trail had been hewn that led downward to the base. Preceded by the lion, Tarzan descended into the valley, which, at this point, was forested with large trees. Before him the trail wound onward toward the center of the valley. Raucous-voiced birds of brilliant plumage screamed among the branches, while innumerable monkeys chattered and scolded above him. The forest teemed with life, and yet there was borne in upon the ape-man a sense of unutterable loneliness, a sensation that he never before had felt in his beloved jungles. There was unreality in everything about him in the valley itself, lying hidden and forgotten in what was supposed to be an arid waste. The birds and the monkeys, while similar in type to many with which he was familiar, were identical with none, nor was the vegetation without its idiosyncrasies. It was as though he had been suddenly transported to another world, and he felt a strange restlessness that might easily have been a premonition of danger. Fruits were growing among the trees, and some of these he saw that Manu, the monkey, ate. Being hungry, he swung to the lower branches, and amidst a great chattering of the monkeys, proceeded to eat such of the fruit as he saw the monkeys ate in safety. When he had partially satisfied his hunger for meat alone could fully do so, he looked about him for Numa of the pit to discover that the lion had gone.